Okay, in today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to process invoices using ARM's AP approval workflow module. We're going to go through three different examples, but firstly what I'll do is I'll set the scene and give you a bit of an idea of or an overview of what the workflow actually looks like and how the process works, and then we'll get into those examples. So I'm going to first of all log in as Maurice. And Maurice is a user in our ARM system who has the ability to be able to create new AP invoices or enter new AP invoices. So the way that it works in ARM is that all of your invoices will firstly be scanned because they need to be in a digital format, usually PDF, and you will designate a folder either on your local drive or on your network where those PDFs will collect ready for processing. In ARM we call this the work list. So you can see over on the left hand side here we have a work list folder, and when I click on that you'll be able to see that there are a number of invoices which are yet to be processed. So the workflow would be that Maurice or whoever's processing the invoices would access this worklist folder. They would select the invoice that they wish to process. That invoice will then open up, and you will see in a moment that the screen will split, and you'll actually see the scan on the right hand side of the screen. And then on the left you have all the AP entry fields to enter things like the invoice number, the date, the vendor, that sort of information. And then if this invoice is associated with a purchase order, we can then go through, find the received purchase order lines to match to this invoice. And then once we've matched those lines to the invoice, then we submit the invoice for approval. Now, if there isn't any variance between the invoice and the purchase order lines, then no problem, we bypass approval and this invoice will become fully approved and it will go through to Epicor. However, in the case where we may have a variance, ARM can actually determine how far that variance can be out. It's what we call a tolerance before the approval tree needs to be triggered and approval needs to be given. And we do this because often in the real world, when there are variances with an invoice, often they're not significant enough to warrant going through the approval process. So in other words, you might allow a certain variance on your invoicing before it triggers approval. So let's go through the first example. The first example is going to be where we have an invoice that's been received. We need to process it, but there is an associated purchase order. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open 2306201. So this is the invoice that I wish to process. I select the invoice and click Create Invoice. Now you'll see that the invoice appears in front of me. I enter the invoice number, which is 2306201, enter the vendor, and click OK. The screen will now split, and once the screen splits, you can see over on the right-hand side, I can see all the detail of my invoice. If I need to, I can actually zoom in or out to make it larger to read if I need it. But the first step would be to enter the value of this invoice, which is $189.50. Now I can also see on this invoice on the right-hand side that there's a purchase order number here, 1354. So I know that this invoice has come from a purchase order. Now, what's been planned ahead of time here is that we've already sent off the purchase order, we've already received the goods, and we've received them, entered them in. Now we have to match these receipt lines to the invoice. So in other words, because we have a purchase order, we can actually click the Add from Receipts button here, and what ARM will do is it will go and find all of the purchase orders for the vendor ACME where the purchase order lines have been received but not yet invoiced. Okay, so we can see clearly here that we have purchase order number 1354, 3 lines. So I select those lines and I click Finish, and ARM now imports those receipt lines into my invoice document here. So there we go. All right, and upon importing these, it calculates the value of these 3 lines and it compares them against what we've just entered on the invoice. So you can see here that we have a variance of 0. So in other words, the receipt lines that we have perfectly match the invoice lines or the total of the invoice that we can see on the right hand side. So in this case there's no variance at all, and that's handy because now when Maurice submits this invoice, we should find that we don't have any approval process to run through because there's no variance at all. Okay, so this invoice is now fully approved, and in fact, if we were to go into Epicor even now under the AP invoice tracker, we would be able to enter this invoice number. In fact, let's do that. So I'm going to go now into Epicor, Here's my invoice tracker. I enter the invoice number. Sorry, was it 2306201? And I can see, or should be able to see, that invoice has now populated Epicor. But most importantly, when you look down the left-hand side, you can see that it's actually brought the attachment through as well. So at any time, if I'm using Epicor rather than ARM, I can still see a copy of this invoice, which has now been filtered through. Okay. Now, in addition to that, what we'll also notice that if we go back to the work list, that original invoice that we worked through has now been removed from that work list. So there's no chance that anybody's going to double invoice it, or if there's going to be any issues of that nature. So once the invoice is processed and submitted, it removes itself from the work list. So the work list is a good way of telling how much activity is still required. So how many invoices are yet to be processed. Okay, it's kind of like a running work list, if you like. In this second example, we're going to look at the scenario where we once again have an invoice to process and there is an associated purchase order for this invoice. However, one of the lines is going to have variance, and so we're going to have a bit of a look at what happens in that scenario. So once again, we go into our work list and we select the invoice that we wish to process. Let's pick this one here. Create invoice. Again, the screen appears to us. We can see the details, so we can enter these in. The vendor is ACME. Okay. And as we saw before, the screen will now split and we'll have a side-by-side view. And our first step, once again, is to enter the total amount of the invoice, which is $204.50. Now, we know also that this invoice is associated with purchase order number 1361. We can see that on the right-hand side. So as before, we click on the Add Receipts button and we look for purchase order number 1361. And we can see that we have 2 lines here, or 3 lines there rather. So we import these lines and then we check to see if there's any variance. And we can see that in this case there actually is. So there's a $15 variance. In other words, the receipt lines that we've imported do not match the total of the invoice on the right-hand side. So it's Maurice's job now to investigate and to figure out where this variance is. Now, to make a long story short, I'm going to tell you this third line here, we had raised a purchase order for component 00C3, 10 of them at $3, but the invoice is clearly showing that there should be 10 of them at $4.50, so there's a discrepancy there. So what would happen in this scenario is that we change the amount to match the invoice, $4.50, and we click Save, and what we can see now is that the invoice will revert to 0. But ARM knows that an adjustment has occurred here on this third line. Now, when we submit this this invoice now, rather than going straight through as it did in the first example, it now triggers an approval workflow, and this is really the crux of the AP approval module and what it's all about. So where there is a variance, we can actually set up a dedicated approval workflow for the invoice process. So you can see that Jen has been triggered for approval. And as is the case with ARM when we talk about requisitions, Jen, or whoever the approver is now emailed, and it's going to be their responsibility to respond to that email either by logging back into ARM and approving this invoice, or as per our new releases, you can actually approve that directly from email. So let's log in now as Jen, and we'll quickly run through the approval process in case we haven't seen it before. So Jen signs in, and you can see on her dashboard that she has some AP requiring her approval. So she clicks on that, and not surprisingly, the last one that was submitted appears at the top of her list. And here we go. So we're now into the invoice again. Jen can see where the adjustment has been made here. Compare that to the not only the original purchase order amount of $3, but also what the invoice is asking. And if she's happy to approve this variance, then she can go ahead and click approve. If she's not, she can deny that, enter a reason for that denial, and then of course the invoice goes no further until subsequent steps are taken. But in this case, I'm going to approve. I'm happy with that variance. It's okay to go through. And now, because there's no further approval, this invoice is now fully approved. And as was the case with the first example, the attachment will now sync through to Epicor. And again, this is now a fully approved invoice in Epicor along with the attachment that we see. But let's take a closer look now at what occurred respective to this approval flow, because there are a few new features here worth talking about. So the first one is the approvals maintenance screen, and this is where we can see that we have a dedicated approval tree set up and triggered just for dealing with invoice variances. Okay, so if I look at that tree in closer detail, I can see that in this case, any invoice where the coded line is ending in 00, 10, 20, or 30, it's going to go to Jen to approval. And that's what we just saw in this example. But there is another scenario here where if the cost center was 40 or 50, it would actually go through to Adam. So we've just configured a very basic tree that says if there's a variance, these are the people that need to approve it. Okay, but there's also another circumstance under whether to determine whether approval is actually necessary. And that was what I was alluding to in the beginning, where we might have a variance, but the variance isn't really enough to warrant running this invoice through an approval process. And this is where we talk about the tolerance setting. Okay, so I have a rule configured here that says if the cost of any receipt line varies to the invoice line by more than 2%, and that can be above or below the expected amount, then I want to take steps or take action. And that action doesn't have to be approval, although that's what we have configured today. So this rule is basically saying if the unit cost varies by more than 2% to what we expect, then for AP invoicing, we want to trigger approval. But we could say, no, let it still go through without approval, just send the person entering that invoice a warning, or take no action at all, or actually hard block that from going any further. So there's a couple of different choices we have there. For the example today, we set it for approval. Okay, so that's actually showing you, and we've just completed now the process of processing an invoice where we have an associated purchase order, but there is a variance between the receipted lines of that purchase order and the invoice that we've received. Now in this third example, we are going to look at the scenario where we have an invoice to process, but unlike the other two examples, we don't necessarily have a purchase order to associate it with. So this is sometimes known as miscellaneous invoicing or ad hoc invoicing, and I'm going to show you how that process differs a little bit from what we've just seen. So it begins the same way. Maurice will still go into his work list. He will select the invoice which he wishes to process and clicks Create Invoice. Now, in this example, we're actually going to deal with a utilities invoice, an electricity invoice, and it's perhaps a good example to use because often these kinds of invoices vary in their value. So to cut a long story short, you can't often know the value of the invoice until you receive it. So it's a perfect example of a miscellaneous or an ad hoc receipt. But the process starts out the same. So we would enter the invoice number, which is 240620M. We once again enter the vendor, which is ACME, and we click OK. The screen will split. Once again, we see the invoice on the right-hand side. We have our AP entry fields on the left. And once again, we begin with entering firstly the value of the invoice. It's 148 and 49. Now, in our previous examples, we would then look from our list of receipt lines and we would try and match them to the invoice. But of course, in this example, we don't have that because there is no PO. So what we do is we use this second feature here called adding a miscellaneous line. So we click on the button, we're presented with a new screen, and we put in a basic description of whatever it is that we are invoicing today. So we're going to say it's a utilities bill, enter the quantity and cost that's on the bill. We're just going to make this very simple, putting 148 and 49, and then save and close. So what we've just done there is we've added a miscellaneous line for 148.49 with a basic description of what it is, just so that we have something to match against this invoice. Now, because this line hasn't come from a receipt line or anything like that, ARM at this point doesn't know anything about it. So it's going to treat this total value as variance. So when we submit this document, it will absolutely trigger our approval process that we have configured, and we can see that Jen once again is our approver. Now, we went through the approval process in the last example where we had variance against a single line. It's the same process from here, but obviously how we got to this point is a little bit different because we didn't have a receipt line in this case. Now, just as a point of reference, if you were to create miscellaneous invoices and you wanted to, let's say, split this different bill amongst different cost centers, that can be done a number of ways actually in ARM, but definitely is possible. But at the end of the process, once we've gone through approval, we will once again have an approved invoice, which will then flow through to Epicor. It will take the attachment along with it, and there you go. So today we've looked at 3 examples. Just to recap, we looked at an invoice that was being processed where we had an associated purchase order and the values of both the purchase order and the invoice matched. So there was no approval process. That went straight through to Epicor as an approved purchase order. In our second example, we looked at the same thing. So an invoice had come through. There was an associated purchase order, but one of the receipt lines on that purchase order did not match the invoice, and that variance was sufficiently large that it triggered our approval process based on how we configured our tolerances and our approvals, our approval maintenance in ARM. And then our third example, we looked at processing an invoice where there was no purchase order at all. It was a completely miscellaneous or ad hoc invoice. So we created a miscellaneous line, which upon submission, once again, triggered approval before we can ultimately send that through as well as an approved invoice with the attachment going through to Epicor. So hopefully that provides some insight both into the workflow and obviously some of the different features of the AP workflow module.